The rain hammered against the windows of the Thornfield Ranch mansion as 17-year-old Clara Whitmore pressed her trembling hand against her growing belly. Through the storm, she could hear the angry voices echoing from the main parlor below. Her world was about to shatter, and she didn't even know it yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara had arrived at Thornfield Ranch 3 years ago, a skinny, 14-year-old orphan with nothing but the worn dress on her back and a letter of recommendation from the church orphanage in Denver. The letter was brief, stating only that she was hardworking, obedient, and in desperate need of employment. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield had looked her up and down with cold, calculating eyes before nodding curtly and handing her over to the head housekeeper. The Thornfield Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Colorado cattle country, with the main house sitting like a crown jewel atop a gentle rise overlooking the valley. Built from local sandstone and imported timber, it boasted 12 bedrooms, formal dining rooms, a library lined with leather-bound books, and parlors decorated with crystal chandeliers shipped from Europe. The wealth was unmistakable, from the Persian rugs beneath Clara's feet to the oil paintings of long dead Thornfield ancestors gazing down from gilded frames. Bartholomew Thornfield had built this empire from nothing, arriving in Colorado territory in 1868 with a handful of cattle and unlimited ambition. By 1885, he owned more land than some eastern states, employed over 100 ranch hands, and had business interests that stretched from cattle to mining to railroad investments. His wife Margaret came from old Boston money, and their marriage had been as much about combining fortunes as it had been about love. Clara learned these details gradually during her first months at the ranch, picking up fragments of conversation, while she scrubbed floors, served meals, and tended to the endless needs of the household. The servants' quarters were located in a separate wing of the house, connected by a long corridor that kept the working class appropriately distant from the family's living spaces. Her room was barely larger than a closet, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the stables. The work was backbreaking. Clara rose before dawn to light fires throughout the house, ensuring the family would wake to warmth. She helped prepare breakfast in the massive kitchen, where the cook, Mrs. Patterson, ruled with an iron fist and a wooden spoon that she wasn't afraid to use on lazy servants. After breakfast service, Clara would begin the daily cleaning routine, dusting furniture, sweeping floors, washing windows, and scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield was a woman who noticed everything. She conducted daily inspections of the house, running her gloved finger along windowsills and picture frames, searching for any trace of dust or neglect. A single smudge could result in extra duties or reduced wages. She spoke to the servants only when necessary, and then with the tone one might use when addressing a particularly slow-witted animal. The other servants had initially viewed Clara with suspicion. New girls came and went regularly, unable to handle the demanding work or Mrs. Thornfield's exacting standards. But Clara proved different. She never complained, never talked back, and worked harder than anyone expected from someone so young and small. Gradually, the other staff began to accept her, sharing gossip during brief breaks and teaching her the unspoken rules that governed life below stairs. There were 8 full-time house servants: Mrs. Patterson the cook, Sarah the head housemaid, 2 junior maids besides Clara, a scullery girl, a butler named Henderson, and 2 men who handled the heavier cleaning and maintenance tasks. Outside, the ranch employed dozens of cowboys, stable hands, and seasonal workers, but their world rarely intersected with the house staff, except during roundup times, when extra meals needed to be prepared. The Thornfield family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield and their only son, Daniel, who was 21 and had recently returned from completing his education at Harvard University. Daniel was tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with dark hair and green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Unlike his parents, he often acknowledged the servants with a nod or a quiet "thank you" when they served him meals or attended to his needs. Clara first truly noticed Daniel during her second year at the ranch. She was cleaning the library one afternoon when he entered, looking for a particular book about cattle breeding. Instead of ignoring her presence as his parents would have done, he apologized for interrupting her work and even helped her reach a high shelf she'd been struggling with. The brief contact when their hands accidentally touched while passing the cleaning cloth sent an unexpected jolt through Clara's entire body. From that moment, she found herself acutely aware of Daniel's presence in the house. She memorized his daily routines, knowing when he took his morning coffee in the sunroom, when he retreated to the library to read, and when he would saddle his horse for long rides across the ranch property. She began taking extra care with her appearance, despite having only 2 serviceable dresses, and found excuses to clean areas of the house where she might encounter him. Daniel, for his part, seemed to seek out these chance meetings. He would linger in rooms she was cleaning, making polite conversation about the weather or asking about her life before coming to Thornfield. Clara was initially tongue-tied around him, but gradually she began to open up, sharing carefully edited stories about her childhood in the orphanage and her gratitude for the position at the ranch. Their conversations grew longer and more personal. Daniel told her about his time at university, his frustration with his parents' expectations, and his dreams of modernizing the ranch operations. He spoke of wanting to treat the workers better, to share more of the profits, and to build a legacy based on fairness rather than just accumulation of wealth. Clara found herself captivated not just by his physical presence, but by his ideas and his apparent kindness. The turning point came during a fierce blizzard in Clara's 3rd winter at the ranch. She had been tasked with checking all the windows on the 2nd floor to ensure they were properly sealed against the storm. In one of the guest bedrooms, she discovered that snow was blowing through a loose window frame, creating a small drift on the expensive carpet. As she struggled to force the swollen window closed, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He immediately came to help her, and together, they managed to secure the window. But the effort had left them both breathless and standing very close together. Clara became intensely aware of Daniel's proximity, the scent of his cologne, the way his breath created small clouds in the cold room. When he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, she didn't pull away. The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, as if Daniel was afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. Clara had never been kissed before, had never imagined that such a simple touch could create such overwhelming sensations throughout her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. Though whether from cold or emotion was unclear, what began that snowy afternoon developed into a secret relationship that consumed Clara's thoughts and dreams. Daniel would find ways to be alone with her, stealing moments between her duties to talk, to hold her hand, to share increasingly passionate kisses. They met in unused rooms, in the stables after the hands had gone to bed, and during Clara's rare free hours on Sunday afternoons, when she was supposed to be attending church services in town. Daniel promised her that things would change, that somehow they would find a way to be together openly. He spoke of love with the confidence of someone who had never faced truly insurmountable obstacles. Clara wanted to believe him, but she understood the reality of their situations in ways that Daniel, for all his education and good intentions, could not fully grasp. The physical relationship that developed between them felt both inevitable and terrifying to Clara. She had received no education about such matters, only whispered warnings from other servants about the dangers that awaited girls who got themselves in trouble with men above their station. But Daniel was gentle and patient, and Clara found herself powerless to resist the growing intimacy between them. Their secret lasted nearly 8 months. During that time, Clara lived in a state of constant anxiety mixed with unprecedented happiness. Every stolen moment with Daniel felt like a precious gift, but she was always aware that discovery would mean immediate dismissal and disgrace. She became expert at reading the moods and movements of the household, at anticipating when she and Daniel could safely meet. The change in Clara's body began gradually. At first, she attributed her fatigue and occasional nausea to the demanding work schedule and the stress of maintaining their secret. But as weeks passed and her monthly cycle failed to appear, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. She tried to deny the obvious conclusion, but eventually, she could no longer ignore the reality of her situation. Clara's pregnancy became undeniable by early autumn. Her dresses, already loose-fitting to accommodate hard work, began to strain across her expanding middle. She tried binding herself with strips of cloth, but the growing life inside her refused to be hidden. Morning sickness struck at unpredictable times, forcing her to rush from whatever task she was performing to retch in private. The other servants began to notice. Sarah, the head housemaid, cornered Clara one morning after she had been sick for the third time that week. The older woman's eyes were not unkind, but they held a resignation that made Clara's heart sink. "How far along?" Sarah asked quietly, and Clara knew there was no point in denying what had become obvious. 4 months, I think," Clara whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. Sarah sighed heavily. "Does he know? The father?" Clara nodded miserably. She had told Daniel the week before, watching his face cycle through shock, joy, and then dawning realization of what this meant for both of them. He had held her while she cried, promising that he would take care of everything, that he would speak to his parents and make things right. But Clara knew, with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had grown up with nothing, that some problems couldn't be solved with good intentions and privilege. The Thornfield family had not built their fortune by tolerating scandals, and a pregnant servant girl carrying their son's child represented exactly the kind of threat to their reputation and standing that would be dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. The confrontation, when it came, was even worse than Clara had imagined. Mrs. Thornfield appeared in the servants' quarters one evening just after dinner service, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't speak immediately, instead letting her eyes sweep over Clara's obviously pregnant form with undisguised disgust. "You filthy little whore," she said finally, her voice low and venomous. "Did you think we wouldn't notice? Did you think you could hide your shame indefinitely?" Clara's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. Around her, the other servants found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere, leaving her alone to face Mrs. Thornfield's wrath. "I want you out of this house tonight," Mrs. Thornfield continued. "You will take nothing except the clothes you wore when you arrived here. You will speak to no one about your time here, and if I ever hear that you've tried to contact any member of this family, I will ensure that you regret it for the rest of your miserable life." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm that had been building all day chose that moment to break, sending sheets of rain against the windows and rattling the glass in their frames. Clara thought desperately of Daniel, wondering if he knew what was happening, if he would try to intervene. But she realized with crushing certainty that he was probably in town on business, unaware that her world was ending in the servants' quarters below his childhood bedroom. As Mrs. Thornfield swept from the room, leaving Clara alone with her terror and despair, the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She was 17 years old, pregnant, and about to be cast out into a hostile world with no money, no family, and no prospects. The baby growing inside her, which had once seemed like a symbol of the love she shared with Daniel, now felt like a burden that would drag them both into destruction. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Clara sank onto her narrow bed for the last time, pressing both hands against her belly and wondering how she would survive what was coming. In a few hours, she would be walking away from the only home she had known for 3 years, carrying nothing but shame and a child whose father lived in a world she could never truly enter. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Clara realized, with bitter irony, that the weather matched her circumstances perfectly. Both she and the night were dark, violent, and uncertain. But unlike the storm, which would eventually pass, Clara's troubles were just beginning. Clara's hands shook as she gathered her few belongings in the dim light of her small room. The rain hammered relentlessly against her window, and lightning illuminated the darkness in violent flashes. She owned so little that everything fit into a single cloth bundle: an extra chemise, a pair of worn stockings, her mother's prayer book, the only thing she had from her life before the orphanage, and the small amount of money she had managed to save from her meager wages. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with sympathy. The cook pressed a wrapped bundle into Clara's hands without saying a word. Inside, Clara could feel bread, cheese, and what felt like dried meat, enough food for several days if she was careful. The older woman squeezed Clara's shoulder once, before disappearing back into the hallway, unwilling to risk being seen helping the disgraced girl. The walk from the servants' quarters to the main door felt endless. Clara's wet boots squelched against the polished floors she had scrubbed countless times. Every shadow seemed to mock her, every familiar object a reminder of the life she was losing. She paused at the kitchen door, looking back one final time at the world that had been her home. The storm struck her like a physical blow the moment she stepped outside. The wind whipped her thin cloak around her legs, and within seconds she was soaked through to the skin. The main road stretched ahead of her, a ribbon of mud disappearing into the darkness. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the ranch before Mrs. Thornfield could change her mind and send the ranch hands after her. Silverton, the nearest town, lay 12 miles away through country that was dangerous even in good weather. Clara had made the journey only a handful of times, always in the relative safety of the ranch wagon with other servants. Now alone and pregnant, the distance seemed impossible. But she had no choice except to keep walking. The first few miles passed in a blur of rain and determination. Clara kept her head down, watching her feet to avoid the worst of the muddy puddles and fallen branches that littered the road. Her thin shoes were never meant for such conditions, and she could feel water seeping through the worn leather with every step. The bundle of food Mrs. Patterson had given her grew heavier with each mile, but she clutched it desperately, knowing it might be the difference between survival and starvation. By the time she reached Miller's Creek, a small stream that normally ran shallow and clear, Clara faced her first real obstacle. The storm had transformed the gentle waterway into a raging torrent that had overflowed its banks and washed out the simple wooden bridge. In the darkness, she could barely make out the rushing water, but the sound was terrifying, a deep roar that spoke of dangerous currents and hidden debris. Clara sank onto a fallen log, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to flow freely. The creek was impassable, but going around would add hours to her journey through unfamiliar terrain. Behind her lay the ranch and certain destruction. Ahead lay an impossible barrier and an uncertain fate. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the small but unmistakable swell where her child grew. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the unborn life inside her. "I'm so sorry I can't give you better than this." The sound of hoofbeats through the storm made her freeze with terror. Her first thought was that Mrs. Thornfield had sent ranch hands to drag her back, perhaps to make an example of her in front of the other servants. Clara scrambled behind a cluster of bushes, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard over the rain. Instead of the rough voices of ranch hands, she heard someone calling her name. The voice was familiar, beloved, and completely unexpected. Daniel emerged from the darkness on horseback, his usually perfect appearance disheveled by the storm. His hair was plastered to his head, his expensive coat darkened with rain, and his face showed in desperation Clara had never seen before. "Clara, thank God, I've been searching for hours," he said, dismounting and rushing toward her hiding place. "When I returned from town and learned what had happened, ... She emerged from the bushes, suddenly self-conscious about her bedraggled appearance. Daniel's eyes swept over her, taking in her soaked clothing, her mud-stained skirts, and the way. She instinctively protected her belly with both arms. "You shouldn't have come," Clara said, though her heart sang at the sight of him. "Your mother made her position clear. If she discovers you're here—" "I don't care what my mother thinks," Daniel replied fiercely. "This is my child too, and I won't let you face this alone." He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and blessed, but Clara knew it came with a price. "Your parents will disown you," she said quietly. "Everything you've worked for, your inheritance, your future, you'll lose it all for a servant girl and her bastard child." Daniel's hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're not just a servant girl to me, Clara. You never were. I love you, and I should have made that clear to my parents from the beginning, instead of hiding like a coward." The words she had dreamed of hearing now sounded like a death sentence for them both. Clara knew the reality of their world better than Daniel ever could. Love didn't conquer class differences, and passion didn't pay for food or shelter. "Even if that's true," she said, "it doesn't change what I am or where I come from. Your parents will never accept me, and society will never forgive you for marrying beneath your station." "Then we'll go somewhere else," Daniel said with the confidence of someone who had never faced true hardship. "California, Oregon, maybe. Even back east. I have some money of my own, enough to start over somewhere no one knows our history." Clara wanted desperately to believe him, but she had learned hard lessons about the difference between dreams and reality. Still, standing in the storm with his coat around her shoulders and his hands gentle on her face, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Their planning was interrupted by more hoofbeats approaching through the darkness. This time the riders were clearly ranch hands, and they were calling Daniel's name with increasing urgency. Clara recognized the voice of Tom Bradley, the foreman, and felt her brief moment of hope crumble. "You have to go," she urged Daniel. "If they find you here with me, it will make everything worse." "I'm not leaving you alone out here," Daniel said stubbornly. "Then we're both dead," Clara replied with brutal honesty. "At least if you go back now, you might be able to convince your parents that you were simply ensuring I left the area as instructed." The hoofbeats were getting closer, and Clara could see the faint glow of lanterns through the rain. Daniel's face showed his internal struggle, torn between his desire to protect her and the practical reality of their situation. "The old Jameson place," he said suddenly. "About 3 miles north of town, near the abandoned silver mine. The house has been empty for years, but it's still standing. Hide there, and I'll find a way to bring you supplies." Before Clara could protest, Daniel pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. She could feel coins inside, more money than she had ever held at one time. "This should be enough for several weeks if you're careful," he said. "Master Daniel." Tom Bradley's voice was much closer now, perhaps only a few hundred yards away. Daniel kissed Clara quickly, desperately, and then mounted his horse. 3 days, he promised. "Give me 3 days to work on my parents, to find a solution. If I can single quotes T. ... He left the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood. If he couldn't find a way to make this work, she would be truly on her own. Clara watched him ride back toward the approaching search party, her heart breaking as he disappeared into the storm. She clutched the money pouch and his coat, the only tangible proof that the last few minutes hadn't been a dream. The creek remained impassable, but Daniel's mention of the Jameson place had given her a new destination. She knew the old homestead by reputation, a failed farming venture, from the early days of settlement that had been abandoned when the family moved back east. If she could reach it, she would have shelter from the storm and a place to wait while Daniel tried to work a miracle. Finding the narrow path that led north toward the mine required Clara to backtrack almost to the main road, adding precious time to her journey. Her legs were weak from exhaustion and pregnancy, and more than once she had to stop and rest against trees or boulders. The food Mrs. Patterson had given her was soggy from the rain, but Clara forced herself to eat small portions to maintain her strength. The abandoned Jameson homestead materialized from the darkness like something from a ghost story. The main house was a simple two-room structure built from local timber, with a sagging porch and several broken windows. But the roof appeared intact, and Clara could see no obvious holes in the walls. After hours in the storm, even this modest shelter looked like paradise. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking ominously as Clara pushed it open. Inside, moonlight filtering through the broken windows revealed a scene of neglect and decay. The previous occupants had left behind scattered furniture, now covered in dust and cobwebs. Mice scurried away from her footsteps, and she could hear the drip of water where the roof leaked in several places, but it was dry mostly. And it was shelter. Clara found a corner where the roof seemed sound and spread Daniel's coat on the floor as a makeshift bed. She ate a small portion of her remaining food and tried to make herself comfortable, though every sound from outside made her heart race with fear. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of warm beds and safety, only to wake repeatedly to the reality of her situation. Each time consciousness returned, the full weight of her circumstances crashed down anew. She was homeless, pregnant, and dependent on the charity of a man whose family considered her an enemy. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with raindrops. Clara ventured outside to explore her temporary refuge more thoroughly. Behind the main house, she discovered a well that still held clear water, a small root cellar that had been carved into the hillside, and the remnants of what had once been a vegetable garden. The Jameson family had clearly worked hard to make a life in this remote location. Clara could see evidence of their efforts everywhere: carefully laid stone foundations, fruit trees that still bore apples despite years of neglect, and raised beds where vegetables had once grown. It made her sad to think of the dreams that had died here, the hopes that had been abandoned when the reality of frontier life proved too harsh, but it also gave her a flicker of possibility. If she could stay here safely, if Daniel could find a way to help her, perhaps she could make something from this place. The baby would need a home, and while this was far from ideal, it represented a chance at independence that few women in her position could ever hope for. The first day passed slowly. Clara spent her time making the house more habitable, sweeping out the worst of the debris and blocking the broken windows with boards she found scattered around the property. She discovered a cache of preserved food in the root cellar, jarred vegetables and dried meat that the previous owners had left behind. The food was still good, a stroke of fortune that could extend her meager supplies significantly. By evening, Clara had transformed the worst room of the house into something resembling livability. She had found enough unbroken furniture to create a basic living space, and the fireplace, while smoky, provided both warmth and a way to cook food. For the first time since leaving the ranch, she allowed herself to feel a cautious optimism. But as the second day dawned with no sign of Daniel, doubt began to creep in. Perhaps his parents had confined him to the ranch. Perhaps they had discovered his involvement and taken steps to prevent any further contact. Perhaps he had reconsidered the enormity of what he was proposing and decided that love wasn't worth the sacrifice after all. Clara tried to push these thoughts away, focusing instead on practical preparations for whatever came next. She spent time exploring the surrounding area, learning which plants were edible and where she might be able to supplement her food supplies. She practiced starting fires without wasting matches and experimented with preserving the apples from the abandoned orchard. The baby seemed to respond to the relative peace, becoming more active during these quiet hours. Clara would sit by the fire in the evenings, her hands on her belly, talking softly to the child about the world they might build together. She told stories about her own childhood, shared dreams about a future where her child would never know hunger or homelessness, and made promises she hoped desperately she could keep. On the third morning, Clara woke to the sound of a single horse approaching through the forest. Her heart hammered as she peered through a gap in the boarded window, expecting to see Daniel keeping his promise. Instead, she saw Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, dismounting near the well. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knew he was being watched. Clara pressed herself against the wall, mind racing. Had Daniel betrayed her location? Was this some trap orchestrated by Mrs. Thornfield? Tom Bradley had always seemed decent enough, but his loyalty belonged to the family that paid his wages, not to a disgraced servant girl. "Miss Whitmore," Tom called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I know you're in there. I've come alone, and I mean no harm. We need to talk." After several tense minutes, Clara cracked open the warped front door. Tom stood by his horse, hat in his hands, his weathered face showing an expression she couldn't read. He was a man in his 50s who had worked cattle ranches his entire life, rising through the ranks by being reliable, discreet, and absolutely loyal to his employers. "What do you want?" Clara asked, keeping the door mostly closed between them. "To tell you that young Daniel won't be coming," Tom said bluntly. "His parents have sent him to Chicago on urgent business that will keep him away for at least 6 months, maybe longer." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, feeling the last of her hope drain. "Away. Did he Did he ask you to tell me?" Tom's expression softened slightly. "He doesn't know I'm here." The boy fought them tooth and nail, made such a scene that half the household heard it. But Mr. Thornfield can be very persuasive when he needs to be. Daniel left on this morning's train with 2 ranch hands as escorts, supposedly to learn the business operations in the Chicago stockyards. Clara closed her eyes, understanding the full implications. The Thornfields had effectively exiled their son to prevent any further contact with her. Daniel's money and promises of rescue meant nothing against the cold calculations of family power. "There's more," Tom continued. "Mrs. Thornfield has put word out in Silverton and the surrounding towns. She's told everyone that a thieving servant girl ran off with valuable jewelry. Anyone who helps you or gives you work will find themselves on the wrong side of the Thornfield family." The cruelty was breathtaking. Not content with simply casting Clara out, Mrs. Thornfield was ensuring she could find no legitimate employment anywhere in the region. The lie about stolen jewelry would follow Clara wherever she went, making her unemployable and marking her as a criminal. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, suspicious of this unexpected kindness from someone she barely knew. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "I've got a daughter about your age back in Kansas. If she was in your situation, ... He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "Look, I can't help you openly, but I can give you some information that might save your life." He gestured toward the north, where the mountains rose in jagged peaks against the sky. "There's a settlement called Haven Valley about 2 days' ride into the high country. It's not much, maybe 30 families trying to make a go of farming and logging. But they're far enough from civilization that the Thornfield name doesn't carry much weight, and they're desperate enough for workers that they might not ask too many questions about your past." Clara felt a spark of possibility. "How do I get there?" "Follow the old mining trail that starts about a mile east of here. It's rough going, especially for someone in your condition, but it's the only way that doesn't go through Silverton. You'll need supplies, food, warm clothes, camping gear. The weather can turn deadly in the mountains without warning." The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Clara had Daniel's money, but spending it openly would risk exposure. She had no camping equipment, no warm clothing suitable for mountain travel, and no experience surviving in the wilderness. Tom seemed to read her thoughts. There's an old trapper named Jake Morrison who lives in a cabin about 5 miles up the mining trail. He's eccentric, but not a bad man. Lost his wife and kids to cholera years ago and doesn't have much use for polite society anymore. He might be willing to help you get properly equipped for the journey. Before Clara could respond, Tom remounted his horse. I was never here, he said firmly. And if anyone asks, I never saw you, but Miss Whitmore. Don't wait too long to leave. Mrs. Thornfield is the type to hold grudges, and she's not done with you yet. He rode away without looking back, leaving Clara alone with the devastating news and a slim thread of hope. Daniel was gone, possibly forever. Her reputation was destroyed, and staying in the area would only bring more danger. But perhaps, in the mountains, she could find a place where the past didn't matter and the future was still possible. Clara spent the rest of the day preparing for a journey she wasn't sure she could survive. She packed her few belongings, including the precious food supplies and Daniel's coat. The money he had given her would have to last until she could find work, so every expenditure needed to be carefully considered. The walk to Jake Morrison's cabin took longer than expected. The mining trail was overgrown and treacherous, forcing Clara to pick her way carefully over fallen logs and loose rocks. Her pregnancy made her movements clumsy, and she had to rest frequently to catch her breath. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun was setting and her feet were bloody in her inadequate shoes. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see the warm glow of lamplight through the windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale, a cozy retreat from the harsh realities of the world. But Clara knew that appearances could be deceiving. Jake Morrison emerged before she could knock, alerted by the sound of her approach. He was a tall, thin man with wild gray hair and a beard that reached halfway down his chest. His clothes were patched and worn, but clean, and his eyes held an intelligence that surprised Clara. "Well," he said, looking her up and down with frank curiosity, "you must be the girl Tom Bradley mentioned might come calling." Clara's mouth fell open. "He was here? About 3 hours ago. Told me quite a story about a young woman in trouble who might need help getting to Haven Valley." Jake's eyes took in her obvious pregnancy and disheveled appearance. Looks like he wasn't exaggerating about the trouble part. The old trapper invited her inside, and Clara found herself in a cabin that was far more comfortable than its exterior suggested. The main room contained a stone fireplace, handmade furniture, and shelves lined with books, an unexpected luxury in such a remote location. The walls were decorated with animal pelts and hunting trophies, but everything was clean and well maintained. "Sit," Jake commanded, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You look like you're about to fall over." He'd busied himself preparing coffee and something that smelled like stew. "When's the baby due?" "Early spring, I think," Clara admitted, too tired to maintain pretenses. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That gives us some time, but not much. Mountain travel becomes impossible once the heavy snows start, usually around the 1st of December. If you're going to Haven Valley, it needs to be soon." Over the course of the evening, Jake proved to be both knowledgeable and surprisingly sympathetic. He had lived in these mountains for over 20 years and knew every trail, every danger, and every resource available to someone trying to disappear from civilized society. "Haven Valley's a good choice," he said, refilling Clara's coffee cup. "The people there left regular society for various reasons, some running from the law, some from family troubles, some just tired of the way things work down in the flatlands. They've built something decent up there, and they don't judge too harshly as long as you're willing to work." "What kind of work?" Clara asked. "Farming mostly." "Some logging, some mining, a bit of everything." The women run a small school, do the cooking and cleaning for the logging crews. Some of them take in laundry from the mining camps. It's hard work, but honest, and they look after their own. Jake spent the next hour outlining what Clara would need for the journey: warm clothes, proper boots, camping gear, food supplies, and a horse or mule to carry everything. The list seemed overwhelming, but Jake had solutions for most of the problems. "I've got extra gear from my trapping days," he said. "Clothes that might fit you, boots that will keep your feet dry, camping equipment that's seen better days, but still functional. As for transportation, there's a mule in my corral that's getting too old for heavy trapping work, but could handle the trip to Haven Valley." Clara pulled out Daniel's money pouch, ready to negotiate a price, but Jake waved her away. "Keep your money. You'll need it more than I do. Consider this a loan. When you get settled and start earning wages, you can send payment if you feel like it." The unexpected kindness nearly brought Clara to tears. After days of fear and uncertainty, Jake's matter-of-fact generosity felt like a miracle. But she had learned to be suspicious of unexpected help. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I told you I lost my family to cholera. What I didn't mention is that my wife was pregnant when she died. 7 months along with what would have been our third child." His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I couldn't save them, couldn't even be there when it happened. I was 3 days away checking trap lines. So maybe helping you is a way of making peace with that." Clara spent that night in Jake's cabin, sleeping in a real bed for the first time since leaving the ranch. The old trapper insisted she needed rest before attempting the mountain journey, and Clara was grateful for the respite. Her body ached from days of stress and inadequate shelter, and the baby seemed to appreciate the return to comfort. The next morning brought practical preparations. Jake outfitted Clara with wool pants, thick sweaters, waterproof boots, and a heavy coat that had belonged to his late wife. Everything was slightly too large, but the extra room would accommodate her growing pregnancy. He also provided camping gear, a small tent, sleeping rolls, cooking equipment, and enough preserved food to last a week. The mule, a patient gray animal named Jasper, seemed to understand the importance of his mission. Jake spent time showing Clara how to load and balance the packs, how to read the mule's moods, and basic techniques for mountain travel. The trail to Haven Valley splits off from the main mining road about 10 miles north of here, Jake explained, sketching a rough map on a piece of bark. "Look for a cairn, a stack of rocks about shoulder high next to a lightning-struck pine. The valley trail goes west from there, following Copper Creek most of the way." He marked dangerous areas on his makeshift map, places where rock slides were common, stream crossings that could become impassable in bad weather, and campsites where she could safely spend the night. The journey would take 2 full days if the weather held, possibly longer if she encountered problems. "What about wild animals?" Clara asked, thinking of the mountain lions and bears that supposedly roamed these forests. "Make noise when you travel, especially around blind corners," Jake advised. "Most animals will avoid you if they hear you coming. Keep your food packed tight and hang it high when you camp. And if you do encounter something large and unfriendly, don't run. Make yourself look big, back away slowly, and make as much noise as possible." By afternoon, Clara was as ready as she could be for a journey that still seemed impossible. Jasper was loaded with supplies. Jake had given her final instructions, and the weather looked favorable for at least the next few days. But as she prepared to leave the safety of the cabin, Clara felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted to Jake. "I've never been alone in the wilderness, never done anything this dangerous. What if I get lost? What if something happens to the baby?" Jake's weathered face was kind but determined. "You can do this because you have to," he said simply. Sometimes life doesn't give us choices we like, only choices we can live with. You're stronger than you think, and that little one you're carrying is counting on you to be brave. As Clara mounted Jasper and prepared to ride into an uncertain future, Jake called out one final piece of advice. When you get to Haven Valley, ask for a woman named Ruth McKenna. Tell her Jake Morrison sent you and that you need a fresh start. She know what that means. The trail stretched ahead, winding through dense forest toward mountains that seemed impossibly distant. Clara took a deep breath, touched her belly gently, and urged Jasper forward. Behind her lay everything she had ever known. Ahead lay the promise of a place where she and her child might find acceptance. The first miles passed peacefully, with Jasper picking his way confidently along the familiar trail. Clara tried to memorize Jake's instructions while absorbing the stunning beauty of the mountain landscape. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and mountain streams. But as the afternoon wore on and the trail grew steeper, Clara began to understand the true challenge ahead. Every step took her farther from any possibility of help, deeper into a wilderness that cared nothing for her hopes or fears. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the uncertainty of their situation. By evening, Clara reached the first designated campsite, a small clearing beside a stream where previous travelers had built a fire ring from local stones. She managed to set up Jake's tent and start a fire, though both tasks took far longer than expected. The simple act of preparing a meal over an open flame proved surprisingly difficult, and she burned the first batch of food before learning to control the heat. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Clara huddled in her sleeping roll inside the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around her. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made her heart race with fear. But gradually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and she fell into a fitful sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and hopefully new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time since leaving the ranch, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to build a life worth living. The second day of travel brought challenges Clara hadn't anticipated. What had seemed like a clear trail the day before now branched into multiple paths, each disappearing into dense forest with no obvious indication of which led to Haven Valley. Jasper seemed as confused as Clara, stopping frequently to sniff the air and flick his ears uncertainly. Clara consulted Jake's bark map repeatedly, trying to match his crude drawings to the landscape around her. The lightning-struck pine he had mentioned as a landmark was nowhere to be seen, and the stream that was supposed to guide her westward had apparently split into 3 smaller waterways, each flowing in a different direction. By midday, Clara was forced to admit she was lost. The realization brought a wave of panic that made her hands shake and her breath come in short gasps. She dismounted from Jasper and sat on a fallen log, fighting the urge to cry. Getting lost in these mountains could mean death for both her and her unborn child, and the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if protesting the delay. Clara placed both hands on her belly and forced herself to think rationally. Jake had taught her to read basic signs, the direction of water flow, the way moss grew on trees, the position of the sun. She might be lost, but she wasn't helpless. After careful observation, Clara determined that the largest of the 3 streams flowed generally westward, which matched Jake's directions. She decided to follow it, hoping it would eventually lead to the main creek that guided travelers to Haven Valley. The decision felt like a gamble with her life, but staying lost in an increasingly unfamiliar area seemed even more dangerous. The trail alongside the stream was rougher than anything Clara had encountered before. Fallen trees blocked the path, frequently forcing her to dismount and lead Jasper around obstacles. The terrain grew steeper and more rocky, and several times Clara nearly lost her footing on loose stones. Her pregnancy made every movement more awkward and tiring than it should have been. Late in the afternoon, just as Clara was beginning to despair of ever finding civilization again, she heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sound of an axe biting into wood. The rhythmic chopping came from somewhere ahead, indicating the presence of other people. Clara urged Jasper forward, following the sound through a grove of aspen trees whose golden leaves rustled. Like whispered promises, she emerged into a small clearing where a young man was splitting logs for a cabin that appeared to be under construction. He was tall and powerfully built, with sandy brown hair and clothes that marked him as a working man rather than someone from the wealthy ranching families. When he saw Clara approaching, he set down his axe and watched her with curious but wary eyes. "You lost, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent Clara couldn't immediately place. "I'm looking for Haven Valley," Clara replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I was told there might be work available there." The young man studied her more carefully, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her travel-worn appearance, and the heavily loaded mule. His expression shifted from wariness to concern. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said, and Clara's heart nearly stopped. Had Mrs. Thornfield's lies about stolen jewelry spread even this far into the mountains? Seeing her alarm, the man quickly raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Don't worry, Jake Morrison stopped by yesterday and told us you might be coming through. I'm Marcus Kane, and this is going to be my family's new home once I get it finished." Relief flooded through Clara so intensely that she had to grip Jasper's saddle to keep from falling. "Jake told you about me?" He said a young woman in difficult circumstances might need help getting to Haven Valley, and that we should offer assistance if we could. Marcus gestured toward his half-built cabin. "Haven Valley is still about 6 miles from here, but you're welcome to rest and have a meal before continuing. My wife Emma would never forgive me if I let a pregnant woman pass by without offering hospitality." As if summoned by his words, a woman emerged from a tent pitched near the construction site. Emma Kane was perhaps 25 years old, with brown hair pinned back practically and a face that radiated warmth and competence. She took one look at Clara and immediately went into action. "Marcus Kane, you get that poor girl down from that mule this instant," Emma commanded. "Can't you see she's exhausted?" She turned to Clara with a smile that felt like sunshine after days of fear. "I'm Emma, and you're staying for supper and the night. No arguments." The Kane family's temporary camp was simple but comfortable. Their tent was larger than Clara's and equipped with amenities that spoke of careful planning and adequate resources. Marcus explained that they were among several families who had decided to settle in the area, drawn by cheap land and the promise of independence from the social constraints of more established communities. "We came out from Pennsylvania," Emma said. She prepared a meal that was far more elaborate than anything Clara had eaten in days. "Marcus's family owns a small farm there, but land is expensive and opportunities are limited. When we heard about the possibilities out here, we decided to take the chance." "What about you?" Marcus asked Clara. "Jake didn't give us many details about your situation." Clara found herself in the familiar position of deciding how much truth to reveal. The Kane seemed genuinely kind, but she had learned to be cautious about trusting anyone completely. "I was working as a household servant," she said carefully. "When I found myself in this condition, my employment was terminated. I heard that Haven Valley might offer opportunities for someone willing to work hard." Emma's expression showed that she understood far more than Clara had explicitly stated. "The father?" she asked gently. "He's been sent away by his family," Clara replied, fighting back tears. "I don't expect to see him again." The simple statement carried the weight of her entire heartbreak, and Emma immediately moved to sit beside Clara, offering the kind of wordless comfort that only another woman could provide. "I know it's hard to believe right now," Emma said softly. But sometimes what seems like the end of everything turns out to be the beginning of something better. That evening, sitting around the campfire with the Canes, Clara experienced something she had almost forgotten: the simple pleasure of human companionship without fear or judgment. Marcus told stories about their journey west, the challenges of starting a new life in the wilderness, and his hopes for the community they were helping to build. Emma shared practical advice about pregnancy and childbirth, information that Clara desperately needed but had no one else to ask. "There's a midwife in Haven Valley," Emma mentioned casually. "Sarah Bramwell. She's delivered dozens of babies and hasn't lost a mother or child yet. She'll take good care of you when your time comes." The conversation drifted to practical matters about life in Haven Valley. The community was small but growing, with families scattered across the valley floor and up into the surrounding hills. They grew their own food, raised livestock, and operated a small sawmill that provided lumber for construction and some income from sales to mining camps. "The winters are hard," Marcus warned, "really hard. You need to be prepared for months of snow and temperatures that can kill you if you're not careful. But the people look out for each other, and everyone works together to make sure no one goes without the necessities." Clara learned that Haven Valley operated on principles that would have been radical in conventional society. Women could own property, unmarried mothers were accepted without scandal, and decisions affecting the community were made collectively rather than by whoever had the most money or social standing. "Ruth McKenna that Jake mentioned, she's sort of the unofficial leader," Emma explained. "She was one of the first settlers, and she's helped establish most of the community's traditions. If Ruth vouches for you, you'll be accepted immediately." As the fire died down and the evening grew cold, Emma insisted that Clara sleep in their tent while the Canes made do with extra blankets by the fire. The gesture was small but profound, representing the kind of selfless generosity that Clara had rarely experienced. At the final morning of her journey dawned clear and bright, with the crisp air carrying the promise of autumn's advance toward winter. Marcus provided detailed directions to Haven Valley, describing landmarks that would ensure Clara didn't get lost again. "Follow the main trail for about 3 miles until you reach Widow's Rock. You can't miss it. It's a granite formation that looks like a woman in mourning," he instructed. "Turn south there and follow Copper Creek down into the valley. You'll see the settlement spread out below you once you crest the final ridge." Emma packed extra food for Clara's journey and gave her a hand-knitted scarf that would provide warmth during the cold mountain nights ahead. "For when the baby comes," she said, pressing a small package into Clara's hands. "Some things every new mother needs." The parting was emotional for Clara, who had grown attached to the Canes' kindness in the short time they had spent together. They represented the possibility of finding people who would accept her without judgment, who would value her work and character rather than condemning her for past mistakes. The trail to Haven Valley proved as clear as Marcus had promised. Widow's Rock was indeed unmistakable, a massive granite outcropping that erosion had carved into the rough shape of a woman with her head bowed in grief. From there, the path descended gradually through stands of aspen and pine, following the musical sound of running water. Clara's first glimpse of Haven Valley took her breath away. The settlement spread across a broad meadow surrounded by towering mountains, with Copper Creek meandering through the center like a silver ribbon. Cabins and farmhouses dotted the landscape, connected by well-worn paths and surrounded by fields where the last harvest of the season was being gathered. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Clara could see people moving about their daily tasks: women hanging laundry, men working in fields, children playing near the creek. It looked like something from a storybook, a hidden paradise where life proceeded at a peaceful pace, far removed from the harsh realities of the outside world. As Clara descended into the valley, several people stopped their work to watch her approach. Their expressions were curious but not unfriendly, and more than one person waved in greeting. A group of children ran alongside Jasper for a short distance, chattering excitedly about the newcomer before their mothers called them back. The largest building in the settlement appeared to be a combination general store and meeting hall, with a wide porch where several people had gathered to observe Clara's arrival. An older woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression stepped forward as Clara dismounted near the building. "You'd be Clara Whitmore," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Jake Morrison sent word you might be coming our way." "I'm Ruth McKenna." Clara felt a rush of relief at finally reaching her destination and finding the person Jake had told her to seek out. "Yes, ma'am. Jake said you might be able to help me find work and a place to stay." Ruth's eyes took in Clara's obvious pregnancy, her travel-worn appearance, and the determined set of her shoulders. "We'll see about that. First, though, you look like you could use a hot meal and a chance to wash off the trail dust. My house is just up the road. We can discuss details once you've had a chance to rest." As Ruth led Clara toward a neat cabin, surrounded by a well-tended garden, several other women approached to introduce themselves and offer assistance. Their acceptance seemed genuine, without the prying questions or judgmental looks Clara had expected. It was as if her past simply didn't matter here, only her willingness to contribute to the community's well-being. "The important thing," Ruth said as they walked, "is whether you're prepared to work hard and be part of something bigger than yourself. We don't have room for people who expect to be taken care of without contributing, but we also don't abandon anyone who's truly trying to build a better life." Clara looked around at the thriving settlement, the friendly faces, and the beautiful valley that could potentially become her home. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would work out after all. "I'm ready to work," Clara said firmly. "I want to earn my place here." Ruth smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Clara had seen from her. "Good, then let's see about getting you settled in. Tomorrow we can start figuring out where you fit best in our little community." As they reached Ruth's cabin, Clara felt the baby move actively inside her, as if responding to the sense of safety and possibility that surrounded them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Clara was no longer facing them alone. She had found her refuge in the mountains, and with it, hope for a future she had almost stopped believing was possible. Ruth McKenna's cabin proved to be a testament to practical frontier living elevated by feminine touches. The main room featured hand-hewn furniture softened by colorful quilts and cushions, shelves lined with preserving jars and books, and windows dressed with curtains made from flour sacks that had been bleached white and embroidered with delicate flowers. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating warmth that seemed to seep into Clara's bones after days of mountain cold. "Sit yourself down while I heat some water," Ruth commanded, bustling around the kitchen area with efficient movements. "You'll want a proper wash and a decent meal before we talk business." While Ruth worked, Clara observed her hostess more carefully. Ruth appeared to be in her early 40s, with streaks of silver threading through hair that had once been auburn. Her hands showed the calluses and scars of hard physical labor, but her bearing suggested someone accustomed to making decisions and having them respected. There was something in her eyes, a depth of experience that spoke of challenges overcome and wisdom hard-earned. The meal Ruth prepared was simple but satisfying. Venison stew thick with vegetables from her garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and milk that had clearly come from her own cow that morning. Clara found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't felt in weeks, the combination of safety and nourishment working to restore both her body and spirit. "Now then," Ruth said once Clara had finished eating and had a chance to wash with hot water and soap that smelled of lavender. Jake's message was brief, but I gather you found yourself in the family way without benefit of a husband, and the father's family took exception to the situation. Clara nodded, grateful that Ruth's directness meant she wouldn't have to navigate careful euphemisms. I was a servant in their household. When they discovered my condition, I was turned out immediately. The father tried to help, but his parents sent him away and made sure I couldn't find work anywhere in the area. Rich folks, Ruth said with a snort of disgust. They think their money makes them better than everyone else, but they're just as human as the rest of us when it comes to basic needs and desires. The only difference is they have the power to avoid consequences for their actions. The understanding in Ruth's voice encouraged Clara to share more details about her situation. She found herself describing her childhood in the orphanage, her years at Thornfield Ranch, her relationship with Daniel, and the increasingly desperate circumstances that had led her to Haven Valley. Ruth listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful as the story progressed. When Clara finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I came here for similar reasons, Ruth said finally. Different details, but the same basic story. A man with more power than character, a pregnancy that wasn't socially acceptable, and a choice between disgrace and exile. She turned to look directly at Clara. That was 15 years ago. My daughter Mary is 14 now and has never known anything but acceptance and love from this community. The revelation that Ruth had faced similar circumstances filled Clara with hope. If Ruth had not only survived but thrived enough to become a community leader, perhaps Clara's future wasn't as bleak as it had seemed. What happened to Mary's father? Clara asked hesitantly. Nothing, Ruth said with bitter satisfaction. He went on with his life exactly as if nothing had happened. Married the woman his parents chose for him, inherited the family business, probably never thinks about me or Mary from one year to the next. But we're better off without him. Mary has grown up in a place where people are valued for who they are, not what family they were born into. Ruth stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, returning with a bundle of fabric. These were mine when I was carrying Mary. They should see you through the rest of your pregnancy and give you something decent to wear while you're getting established. The clothes were well made and carefully maintained dresses with panels that could be let out as pregnancy progressed, comfortable undergarments, and a warm cloak that would provide protection against mountain weather. Clara's eyes filled with tears at the generous gesture. I can't accept all this, she protested. You've already done so much ... You can and you will, Ruth said firmly. This is how we survive out here, by taking care of each other. When you're established and someone else needs help, you'll pass the kindness along. That's how community works. The next morning brought Clara's introduction to the practical realities of life in Haven Valley. Ruth took her on a tour of the settlement, explaining how various enterprises operated and where Clara might fit into the community's economic structure. The sawmill was the largest operation, employing a dozen men who cut timber from the surrounding forests and processed it into lumber for local construction and sale to mining operations throughout the region. The mill was owned collectively by the community, with profits shared among all residents according to their contributions of labor or resources. Several families operated farms that supplied vegetables, grain, and meat to the community and provided surplus for trade with outside settlements. The women ran a cooperative laundry service that cleaned clothes for mining camps, bringing in steady income that helped support families through the harsh winter months when other work was scarce. There's also the school, Ruth mentioned as they passed a one-room building where children's voices could be heard reciting lessons. We need someone to help with the younger children, especially since our current teacher is expecting her fourth child and won't be able to manage the full load much longer. Clara's heart leaped at the possibility. Teaching was respectable work that would allow her to contribute meaningfully while learning about the community through its children. I can read and write well, she said. I helped with lessons at the orphanage before I went to work at the ranch. We'll speak to Martha Cowlson about that later, Ruth promised. But first, let's see about getting you a place to live. The housing situation in Haven Valley reflected the community's practical Approach to social problems. Several women lived together in arrangements that provided mutual support while sharing expenses. Widows, unmarried mothers, and women whose husbands worked away from the settlement had formed informal households that functioned as extended families. There's a cabin about half a mile up the creek that's been empty since the Hendersons moved to Oregon last spring, Ruth explained as they walked along a well-worn path. It's small but sound, and it sits on a good piece of land where you could have a garden and maybe keep a few chickens. The community decided to hold it for someone who really needed a fresh start. The cabin proved to be exactly what Clara had hoped for: a simple two-room structure with a stone chimney, wooden floors, and windows that looked out over the creek and mountains beyond. It was furnished with basic necessities: a bed, table, chairs, cooking equipment, and even a small spinning wheel left by the previous occupants. The rent is your labor, Ruth explained. You work for the community's benefit, and the community provides you with shelter. If you decide to stay permanently and want to own the place outright, we can work out an arrangement for that too. Clara walked through the small rooms, imagining how they would look with her few possessions arranged inside, picturing a cradle near the fireplace where her baby would sleep safely. For the first time since leaving Thornfield Ranch, she could envision a real future rather than just survival from day to day. The afternoon brought meetings with other community members who would be important to Clara's integration into Haven Valley life. Martha Cowlson, the overwhelmed schoolteacher, was enthusiastic about having help with the younger children and immediately began outlining Clara's potential duties. The little ones need someone who can be patient with their questions and help them with basic reading and arithmetic, Martha explained. I'll handle the older children's advanced lessons, but having assistance with the primary classes would be a godsend. Dr. James Morrison, who turned out to be Jake Morrison's younger brother, examined Clara and pronounced both mother and baby healthy despite the recent hardships. You'll want to start taking better care of yourself now that you're settled, he advised. More rest, regular meals, and less worry about the future. This community has never lost a mother or baby during childbirth, and we don't intend to start with you. Sarah Bramwell, the midwife Emma Kane had mentioned, proved to be a treasure trove of practical information about pregnancy and childbirth. She was a woman in her 60s who had delivered babies across the frontier for over 30 years, and her calm competence immediately put Clara at ease. First babies usually take their time arriving, Sarah said with a reassuring smile. We'll have plenty of opportunity to prepare properly, and I'll be checking on you regularly to make sure everything is progressing normally. As the days passed, Clara settled into the rhythms of Haven Valley life with surprising ease. Her work at the school proved both challenging and rewarding. The children were bright and eager to learn, and their acceptance of Clara's presence without questions about her marital status reinforced the community's commitment to judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. The physical work was demanding but satisfying. Clara helped with laundry operations 2 days a week, earning money that allowed her to purchase necessities and begin saving for the baby's needs. She spent her free time improving the cabin, planting a small garden for next year's growing season, and learning skills like preserving food and spinning wool that would make her more self-sufficient. The women of Haven Valley proved to be an invaluable source of support and friendship. They shared advice about everything from the best methods for keeping a house warm during mountain winters to recipes that could stretch limited ingredients into satisfying meals. Clara found herself part of an informal network that functioned almost like an extended family. But it was during her 4th week in the settlement that Clara's carefully rebuilt sense of security received an unexpected shock. She was teaching arithmetic to a group of 6-year-olds when Ruth appeared in the schoolroom doorway, her expression serious and slightly troubled. Clara, I need to speak with you privately, Ruth said. Martha, can you manage both groups for a few minutes? Outside the schoolhouse, Ruth wasted no time with pleasantries. We've had a visitor asking questions about you. A young man on a fine horse, well-dressed, claiming to be looking for his missing sister who might have come this way. Clara's heart began pounding so hard she was certain Ruth could hear it. What did he look like? Tall, dark hair, green eyes, spoke like someone with education and money. Sound familiar? Daniel. Somehow and possibly, Daniel had found her. Clara's emotions warred between joy at the thought of seeing him again and terror at what his presence might mean for her newfound security. "Did you tell him anything?" Clara asked. "I told him we hadn't seen anyone matching his sister's description," Ruth replied. "But Clara, he's persistent, and he's asking questions in other settlements too. If he's really looking for you, he's going to find you eventually." Clara sank onto the schoolhouse steps, overwhelmed by the implications. If Daniel had come looking for her, it meant he had either defied his parents or found some way to gain their approval for the relationship. But it could also mean that the Thornfield family had decided she represented a threat that needed to be permanently eliminated. "Is he the father?" Ruth asked gently. Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Do you want to see him?" It was the question Clara had been avoiding since the moment she learned of Daniel's search. Part of her desperately wanted to run to him, to fall into his arms and let him solve all her problems. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger during her weeks of independence, wondered if she really wanted to give up the life she had begun building for herself. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I love him, but I've learned to take care of myself. I'm not sure I want to go back to being dependent on someone else's decisions about my future." Ruth studied Clara's face carefully. "Well, you don't have to decide right now. But you should know that he's planning to stay in the area until he finds what he's looking for." And Clara ... "There's something else. He's not alone. There are 3 other men with him, and they're all armed." The news sent a chill down Clara's spine. Armed men accompanying Daniel could mean several things, none of them particularly reassuring. Either Daniel's family had sent enforcers to ensure Clara never troubled them again, or Daniel himself was prepared to use force to get what he wanted. "What should I do?" Clara asked. "That's up to you," Ruth replied. "But whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. This community protects its own, and you're one of us now." As Clara returned to her teaching duties, trying to maintain a normal facade while her mind raced with possibilities, she realized that her mountain refuge was about to be tested. The past she had tried to escape was approaching rapidly, and soon she would have to decide whether to embrace it or fight to protect the future she had begun to build for herself and her child. The mountains that had seemed like protective barriers now felt like prison walls. And Clara wondered if there was anywhere in the world where she could truly be free from the consequences of falling in love with someone whose family considered her beneath their notice. Clara spent the next 2 days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound and scanning the tree line around the settlement for signs of approaching riders. Ruth had organized the community's response with military precision. Lookouts were posted at strategic points around the valley, and word was spread that any strangers asking questions should be directed to Ruth herself. The women of Haven Valley rallied around Clara with fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These people barely knew her, yet they were prepared to shield her from potential danger as if she were family. Martha Cowlson insisted Clara stay at her house rather than alone in the cabin, while Sarah Bramwell made pointed comments about men who abandoned pregnant women and then showed up expecting to be welcomed back. "Some folks think they can treat people like property," Sarah muttered while checking Clara's condition during one of her regular visits. "Think they can discard someone when it's convenient and reclaim them when it suits their purposes. Well, they'll find out different if they try that nonsense here." On the 3rd day, the waiting ended. Clara was helping Martha prepare lunch for the school children when young Timothy Walsh came running up the path, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Miss Ruth says to come quick. he panted. "The strangers are here, and they're asking to speak with everyone in the settlement. They're down by the mill." Clara's hands began trembling so violently that she had to set down the bread she was slicing. Through the window, she could see people emerging from their homes and workshops, moving toward the sawmill with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. "You don't have to go," Martha said firmly. "You can stay here with the children, or slip out the back and hide in the woods until they leave." But Clara knew hiding would only delay the inevitable. If Daniel was truly determined to find her, he would keep searching until he succeeded. Better to face whatever was coming on her own terms, surrounded by people who cared about her welfare. "No," Clara said, straightening her shoulders. "I need to see what this is about." The walk to the sawmill felt endless, though it took only a few minutes. Clara's heart pounded harder with each step, and the baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly inside her. By the time she reached, the crowd gathered around the mill's main building. Her hands were clammy with nervous perspiration. Ruth stood on the mill's loading platform, facing 4 mounted men who had positioned themselves where they could survey the entire gathering. Clara's breath caught when she saw Daniel, looking exactly as handsome and confident as she remembered, but somehow different too, harder, more determined, with an edge she had never seen before. The 3 men with him were strangers, but their bearing and equipment marked them as professional gunfighters rather than ordinary ranch hands. They wore their weapons with casual familiarity and watched the crowd with eyes that missed nothing. Clara felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "As I was explaining," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "we're looking for a young woman who may have sought shelter in your community. Her name is Clara Whitmore, and her family is extremely worried about her welfare." The lie was so smooth and confident that Clara almost admired its audacity. To hear Daniel tell it, she was a beloved family member whose disappearance had caused great distress rather than a disgraced servant who had been cast out in disgrace. "She's about 17 years old, with dark brown hair and blue eyes," Daniel continued. "She may be traveling with a gray mule and calling herself by a different name. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return." Ruth's expression was a masterpiece of polite indifference. "That's a touching story, young man, but I'm afraid we haven't seen anyone matching that description. As you can see, we're a small community where everyone knows everyone else. A stranger would be noticed immediately." One of the gunmen leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "Maybe you folks need some time to think about it. That reward I mentioned, it's $500 for information, $1,000 for safe delivery of the girl." A murmur ran through the crowd. $500 was more money than most of these people would see in several years, enough to transform lives and secure futures. Clara held her breath, wondering if anyone would be tempted by such a massive sum. "Money's generous," called out Marcus Kane, who had arrived in the valley just days after Clara, "but we told you the truth. Haven't seen anyone like that around here." Other voices chimed in with similar denials, and Clara felt overwhelmed by the community's loyalty. These people were turning down life-changing money to protect her. Despite knowing her for only a few weeks, Daniel's frustration was becoming visible. "Perhaps I should speak with your women separately. Sometimes they notice things that men miss, especially when it comes to someone in delicate circumstances." "Our women speak for themselves," Ruth said coolly. "And they've already told you what they know." It was then that Clara made her decision. Watching Daniel try to manipulate and intimidate people who had shown her nothing but kindness filled her with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. These people were risking their safety and financial security to protect her, and she couldn't let them continue bearing that burden. "I'm here," Clara called out, stepping forward from the crowd. The effect was immediate and electric. Daniel's face lit up with relief and joy, while his companions tensed and reached for their weapons. The crowd around Clara stirred uneasily, some moving protectively closer to her, while others stepped back to avoid potential crossfire. "Clara!" Daniel exclaimed, dismounting quickly and starting toward her. "Thank God you're safe. When you disappeared from the ranch, we were terrified something terrible had happened to you." Clara held up her hand to stop his advance, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. "I didn't disappear, Daniel. I was thrown out. Your mother made it very clear that I was no longer welcome on Thornfield property or anywhere else she had influence." Daniel's face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shame. "That was a misunderstanding. My parents were upset at first, but they've come to realize that family is more important than social conventions. They've sent me to bring you home, to make things right." "Home?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I was never home there, Daniel. I was a servant who forgot her place and paid the price for it. Things will be different now." Daniel insisted, taking another step forward. "I've convinced my parents that we should be married. The ceremony can take place as soon as we return to the ranch." The offer should have filled Clara with joy. It was everything she had dreamed of during those long nights in the servants' quarters. The fairy tale ending where love conquered social barriers and class differences. But standing in the midst of people who had accepted her without conditions or expectations, Clara found the proposal felt more like a trap than a rescue. "And what about these men?" Clara asked, gesturing toward the armed riders. "Did your parents send them to escort us to our wedding, or to ensure I don't have a choice in the matter?" Daniel's expression flickered with uncertainty. "They're here for protection. The journey back can be dangerous, and my parents wanted to ensure your safety." "Whose safety?" Ruth interjected sharply. "The girls, or your family's reputation?" One of the gunmen urged his horse forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Enough talk. We came here for the girl, and we're taking her back. Whether she comes willing or not isn't really our concern." The threat galvanized the crowd instantly. Men reached for hunting rifles and work tools, while women moved to shield Clara with their own bodies. The tension ratcheted so high that Clara could practically feel violence crackling in the air. "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere against their will," declared Tom Morrison, the mill foreman and Dr. Morrison's eldest son. "This is our valley, and we protect our own." Clara felt the baby kick hard, as if protesting the stress and danger surrounding them. The movement reminded her that this wasn't just about her anymore. She had a child to consider, a future to protect. Whatever decision she made would affect not just her own life, but the life of the innocent being growing inside her. "Daniel," Clara said quietly, her voice somehow carrying despite the crowd's murmurs. "If you really love me, if you truly want what's best for our child, then send these men away. Prove to me that this is about marriage and family, not about controlling a problem that threatens your family's reputation." Daniel looked genuinely torn, glancing between Clara and his armed companions. "Clara, you don't understand the pressures I'm under. My parents. They've made it clear that this is the only way they'll accept our relationship. If I return without you, they'll disown me completely." "Then stay," Clara said simply. "Stay here with me. We can build a life together in this valley, where our child will be accepted and loved regardless of the circumstances of its birth." Suggestion clearly stunned Daniel. "Stay here?" "Clara, look around you. This is nothing. No society, no culture, no opportunities for advancement. Our child deserves better than this primitive existence." His words cut Clara deeply, not because they hurt her feelings, but because they revealed how little Daniel truly understood about what she had found in Haven Valley. He saw only the modest buildings and simple lifestyle, missing entirely the wealth of community, acceptance, and genuine care that surrounded them. "Our child deserves parents who love and respect each other," Clara replied. "Parents who value character over social standing, who build their lives on honesty rather than maintaining appearances. This is touching, interrupted the lead gunman. But we're burning daylight. The girl comes with us now, one way or another. That was when Marcus Kane stepped forward, carrying a rifle with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. I don't think you understand the situation here, friend. This lady is under our protection, and she's made it clear she doesn't want to leave. Your business here is finished. There are 4 of us and dozens of you, the gunman acknowledged. But we're professionals, and most of you are farmers and mill workers. People will die if this goes badly. Starting with you, promised Tom Morrison. Raising his own weapon, Clara realized the situation was spiraling toward violence that could destroy everything she had come to value about Haven Valley. These people were prepared to die for her, but she couldn't live with their blood on her conscience. Stop! Clara called out, stepping between the opposing groups. There's been enough threats and enough fear. Daniel, I'll make you a deal. Daniel's face showed hope mixed with apprehension. What kind of deal? Give me 1 week, Clara said. Send your men back to the ranch and stay here for 1 week. Live in this community. Work alongside these people. See what kind of life we could build together. At the end of that week, if you still believe we'd be better off returning to your family's ranch, I'll come with you willingly. And if I decide this place suits me, then you prove that you're choosing love over duty, and we build our future here together. Daniel looked around the valley, taking in the modest buildings, the watching faces, the life that Clara was offering him. Clara could see him struggling with the decision, weighing his love for her against everything he had been raised to value. 1 week, he said finally. But my men stay nearby in case there's trouble. No, Clara said firmly. Your men leave today. If you're staying to build a relationship with me, then you need to trust that this community will keep you safe. You can't have a foot in both worlds, Daniel. You have to choose. The moment stretched endlessly as Daniel wrestled with the ultimatum. Clara held her breath, knowing that his decision would determine not just their future together, but the future of their child and her place in the community that had become her sanctuary. Finally, Daniel turned to his companions. Ride back to the ranch. Tell my parents I need more time to convince Clara to return. I'll send word when I'm ready to come home. The gunmen exchanged glances that suggested they thought Daniel was making a serious mistake, but they were being paid to follow orders, not to argue with them. Within minutes, they had mounted up and ridden out of the valley, leaving Daniel alone among people who had every reason to distrust him. Clara felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had bought herself a week to discover whether the man she loved could adapt to the life she had chosen, but she had also committed to a decision that would determine the rest of her life. In 7 days, she would either gain a husband who truly understood her, or she would have to choose between love and independence once and for all. The first night of Daniel's week in Haven Valley proved more challenging than Clara had anticipated. The community's initial hostility toward him was palpable. Conversations stopped when he approached. People found urgent tasks elsewhere when he tried to help, and the few interactions he did manage were coldly polite at best. Ruth had grudgingly offered Daniel a place to sleep in the community's guest cabin, a small structure normally reserved for traveling preachers and visiting relatives. The building was clean but sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. After a lifetime of luxury at Thornfield Ranch, the accommodations must have felt like punishment rather than hospitality. Clara watched Daniel's struggles with mixed emotions. Part of her felt sorry for him, seeing how completely out of place he was among people who valued practical skills over breeding and social connections. But another part of her was grimly satisfied that he was finally experiencing the kind of displacement and judgment she had lived with for years. The second day brought Daniel's first real test when Tom Morrison approached him at breakfast with a proposal that was clearly designed to humble him. "We could use an extra hand at the mill today," Tom announced loudly enough for everyone in the dining hall to hear. Think a gentleman like yourself might be willing to get his hands dirty with some honest labor. Daniel's jaw tightened at the obvious challenge, but he nodded stiffly. I'm willing to work wherever I'm needed. Clara spent the morning teaching her younger students while trying not to think about how Daniel was faring at the physically demanding mill work. But by noon, word had spread throughout the settlement about the Thornfield heir's performance, and the reports were not flattering. Soft as a week-old biscuit, Marcus Kane reported with barely concealed amusement. Couldn't handle an axe properly. Nearly took his own foot off with a saw, and had to sit down twice because he was dizzy from the work. Sarah Bramwell was less charitable in her assessment. Boy's never done a real day's work in his life. Thinks because he went to some fancy college he doesn't need to learn how to use his hands. But it was Emma Kane who provided the most insight into Daniel's character during those first difficult days. He's trying, she told Clara privately. He's clearly miserable and exhausted, but he keeps showing up and asking what needs to be done. That counts for something. By the third day, Daniel had begun to earn grudging respect from some community members, not for his skills, which remained laughably inadequate, but for his persistence in the face of obvious contempt. He showed up for work despite blistered hands and aching muscles, accepted criticism without complaint, and gradually began to improve at basic tasks. Clara found herself watching him with growing confusion. The Daniel she remembered had been charming and educated, but he had also been somewhat spoiled and accustomed to having his wishes accommodated. This version of Daniel seemed more serious, more determined, as if the months of separation had forced him to confront aspects of himself he had never examined before. Their first private conversation came on the fourth evening, when Clara encountered Daniel sitting alone by the creek, soaking his injured hands in the cold water. The sight of his raw, bleeding palms stirred unexpected sympathy in her heart. "Let me help with that," Clara said, settling beside him with a jar of Sarah Bramwell had given her. "These wounds need proper treatment or they'll become infected." Daniel submitted to her ministrations without protest, though she could see him wince as she cleaned the worst of the cuts. His hands, once soft and smooth, were now rough with calluses and marked by the honest labor he had been attempting. "I never realized how hard this kind of work could be," Daniel admitted quietly. "At the ranch, I rode around giving orders and reviewing accounts, but I never actually participated in the physical labor that made everything possible." Clara focused on bandaging his hands, trying to ignore the familiar rush of attraction she felt at his nearness. "Why did you really come here, Daniel? And don't tell me it was your parents' idea. I know them well enough to know they would never voluntarily invite a servant into their family." Daniel was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion she had never heard from him before. "Because I couldn't live with myself knowing I had abandoned you," he said simply. "Because every day in Chicago was torture, knowing you were alone and pregnant with my child while I attended business meetings and pretended everything was normal. But the marriage proposal, your parents' acceptance—" "Lies," Daniel interrupted. "All of it. My parents haven't changed their minds about you or about us. They sent me to Chicago hoping I would forget about you, find someone suitable, and settle down like a proper heir should." The admission hit Clara like a physical blow. "Then why the elaborate story about bringing me home? Why the armed men?" Daniel's face flushed with shame. "Because I was desperate and scared. I knew you wouldn't come with me willingly if you thought we'd be returning to the same situation that drove you away. I thought if I could get you back to the ranch, I could somehow convince my parents to accept our relationship once they saw how much I loved you." Clara pulled her hands away from his, anger flaring hot in her chest. "So you lied to me, to these people, planned to essentially kidnap me, all so you could drag me back to a place where I'd be despised and unwelcome." "It sounds terrible when you put it like that," Daniel said miserably. "But Clara, what choice did I have? I love you, and I want to be with you and our child. But I also can't just walk away from everything I've ever known, from my family's legacy and my responsibilities. You could have asked me what I wanted, Clara replied, her voice cold with fury. You could have written to me, found a way to communicate instead of just assuming you knew what was best for both of us. Daniel reached for her hands again, but Clara stood up, putting distance between them. I tried to find you for months, he said desperately. I sent letters to every town in the territory, hired investigators, followed every possible lead. When I finally traced you to Jake Morrison and learned you had come here, I was so relieved you were safe that I didn't think clearly about how to approach you. Clara wanted to stay angry, but she could hear the genuine anguish in Daniel's voice. Despite his poor choices and deceptive methods, she could see that he had been suffering too, that their separation had cost him as much as it had cost her. Your week is half over, Clara said quietly. Have you learned anything about this place, about the kind of life we could have here? Daniel looked around the valley, taking in the modest cabins, the working families, the simple rhythms of daily life that were so different from everything he had ever known. I've learned that I don't know how to do anything useful, he said with bitter honesty. I've learned that these people have something I've never had: real community, genuine care for each other, lives built on substance rather than appearances. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to give up everything I've always been to become someone worthy of living here. The admission was more honest than Clara had expected, and it revealed the core of their dilemma. Daniel could see the value of what Haven Valley offered, but he wasn't sure he could make the sacrifices necessary to claim it. The fifth day brought an unexpected crisis that tested both Daniel's character and the community's willingness to accept him. Young Timothy Walsh, who had brought news of Daniel's arrival, fell through the ice while playing near a beaver pond upstream from the settlement. His terrified screams brought people running from throughout the valley. Clara arrived at the scene to find a crowd gathered on the bank, with several men attempting to reach the boy who was struggling to stay afloat in the freezing water. The ice was too thin to support an adult's weight, but too thick to break easily, creating a deadly trap. Without hesitation, Daniel stripped off his coat and boots, ignoring the protests of the crowd. I'm the lightest adult here, he said grimly. And I'm a strong swimmer. Before anyone could stop him, Daniel had lowered himself into the water and was swimming toward Timothy with powerful strokes. The shock of the cold water was visible on his face, but he didn't hesitate or turn back. Clara held her breath as Daniel reached the boy and managed to grab him, but getting back to shore proved nearly impossible. The current was stronger than expected, and both Daniel and Timothy were rapidly losing strength in the numbing cold. It was Tom Morrison who organized the rescue, directing men to form a human chain that extended into the water far enough to reach the struggling pair. By the time they were pulled to safety, both Daniel and Timothy were blue with cold and barely conscious. The aftermath was a blur of activity as the community worked to warm both victims and treat them for hypothermia. Sarah Bramwell took charge of Timothy while Dr. Morrison attended to Daniel, and Clara found herself helping to rub feeling back into Daniel's frozen limbs. That was incredibly brave, Clara whispered as Daniel's consciousness gradually returned. Or incredibly stupid, Daniel replied through chattering teeth. I couldn't just stand there and watch that boy drown. Word of Daniel's heroic action spread quickly through the settlement, and Clara could see attitudes toward him beginning to shift. People who had been coldly polite began offering genuine smiles, and several men made a point of thanking him for risking his life to save Timothy. It was Timothy's father, Peter Walsh, who provided the most meaningful validation. You saved my boy's life, he said simply, gripping Daniel's hand firmly. Whatever else you've done or haven't done, that makes you family in my book. The incident marked a turning point in Daniel's week-long trial. People began including him in conversations, asking his opinions on community matters, and treating him as a person rather than an unwelcome intruder. Clara watched the transformation with growing hope, seeing glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, but now tempered with genuine humility and a desire to contribute rather than simply take. On the 6th day, Daniel approached Clara with a proposal that surprised her with its thoughtfulness. "I want to make a formal apology to the community," he said, "for the lies I told when I arrived, for bringing armed men into your peaceful valley, for threatening the safety and security you've built here." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated charm, but she saw only sincere remorse. What would that accomplish? "It would be honest," Daniel replied. "And if I'm going to ask these people to accept me as one of them, I need to start with the truth about who I am and what I've done." That evening, Daniel stood before the entire community in the dining hall and delivered an apology that was remarkable for its complete honesty. He admitted to the lies he had told, confessed his original plan to manipulate Clara into returning with him, and acknowledged the privilege and entitlement that had shaped his actions. "I came here thinking I was rescuing someone," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "But I've learned that Clara didn't need rescuing. She had already saved herself and built something better than anything I could offer her. Now I'm the one who needs saving from a life of meaningless privilege and empty traditions." He went on to ask not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove himself worthy of the community's acceptance. "I know I have nothing to offer, but my willingness to work and learn. But if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to call this place home." The response was not immediately positive. Several people remained skeptical of Daniel's motivations and doubtful about his ability to adapt to their way of life. But others, led by Peter Walsh and influenced by Daniel's rescue of Timothy, spoke in favor of giving him a genuine chance. Ruth McConaughey's response was perhaps the most important. "Pretty words are easy," she said bluntly. "Actions matter more than speeches. If you stay, you'll be expected to contribute equally, to take your share of the hard work and responsibility. There won't be any special treatment because of where you came from or who your family is." "I understand," Daniel replied, "and I accept those terms." As the meeting broke up and people began returning to their homes, Clara found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. Tomorrow would mark the end of Daniel's week in Haven Valley, and she would have to choose between the security and independence she had found and the uncertain future Daniel was offering. But for the first time since his arrival, Clara began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something together that honored both their love and the life she had created for herself in the mountains. The morning of the 7th day dawned crisp and clear, with the first hint of winter, frost sparkling on the grass around Clara's cabin. She had spent most of the night lying awake, her mind churning through the decision she would have to make before sunset. The baby had been restless too, as if sensing the importance of the day ahead. Clara rose early and walked to the creek behind her cabin, seeking the peace and clarity that flowing water had always brought her. As she stood watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. A soft footstep behind her announced Daniel's approach. He looked tired, as if he too had spent the night wrestling with uncertainty. His hands were still bandaged from his week of hard labor, and his clothes showed the wear of someone unaccustomed to physical work. "I wanted to speak with you before ... Daniel began, then trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "Before I give you my answer," Clara finished quietly. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the valley wake up around them. Smoke began rising from chimneys, children's voices carried on the morning air, and the sounds of daily life resumed their familiar rhythms. "Whatever you decide," Daniel said finally, "I want you to know that this week has changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. I came here thinking I was offering you salvation, but you've shown me what real life looks like, life built on honest work, genuine community, and people who value each other for who they are rather than what they possess. Clara turned to study his face, looking for any hint of the calculating charm she had once found so attractive. Instead, she saw something deeper and more substantial, a man who had been forced to confront his own limitations and had chosen growth over comfort. "And if I choose to stay here without you?" Clara asked. "If I decide that the risk of trusting you again is too great?" Daniel's expression showed pain, but also acceptance. "Then I'll respect your decision and leave you in peace. But Clara, I hope you'll also consider the possibility that we could build something here together that's better than anything either of us could create alone." Before Clara could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders were coming up the valley trail, moving fast and with obvious purpose. Clara felt her heart sink as she recognized the lead rider, Mrs. Margaret Thornfield, accompanied by what appeared to be a small army of ranch hands and hired guns. "Dear God," Daniel breathed, his face going pale. "What is she doing here?" Clara counted at least a dozen riders, all heavily armed and clearly prepared for trouble. Mrs. Thornfield sat her horse with the imperious bearing of someone accustomed to having her orders obeyed without question, and her expression was cold enough to freeze the morning air. "She's coming to collect her son," Clara said with grim understanding, "and probably to eliminate the problem that's been keeping him from his duties." The sound of the approaching riders had alerted the entire settlement. People emerged from their homes and workplaces, and Clara could see men reaching for weapons while women gathered children and moved them to safety. The peaceful morning was rapidly transforming into something that felt like preparation for war. Ruth McKenna appeared at Clara's side, her face set in lines of determination. "We need to get you somewhere safe," she said urgently. "This has the look of people who didn't come here to talk." But Clara shook her head. "Running will only make things worse. Mrs. Thornfield didn't come all this way to leave empty-handed." The riders reached the settlement center and formed a loose semicircle around the main buildings. Mrs. Thornfield dismounted with practiced grace, her expensive riding habit and perfectly arranged hair a stark contrast to the working clothes and practical styles of the valley residents. "Daniel," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Come here, now." Daniel stepped forward, but instead of the submissive posture Clara expected, he moved with newfound confidence. "Mother, you're a long way from home." "As are you," Mrs. Thornfield replied icily. "Your father sent me to collect you when you failed to return as scheduled. Imagine my surprise to learn that you've been playing house with your little servant girl instead of conducting the business we sent you to handle." The insult to Clara was deliberate and calculated, designed to provoke a reaction. But Clara had learned too much about her own strength to be wounded by words from someone whose opinion no longer mattered to her. "Clara is not my servant," Daniel said firmly. "She's the woman I love and the mother of my child." Mrs. Thornfield's laugh was like breaking glass. "How charming! And what exactly do you propose to do about that infatuation? Abandon your family, your inheritance, your entire future for a moment's pleasure with someone so far beneath your station?" "If necessary, yes." The simple statement sent shock waves through both groups of people. Clara felt her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure, while Mrs. Thornfield's composure cracked for the first time. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "You're coming home immediately, and this ... situation will be dealt with permanently." The threat was unmistakable, and the armed men with her shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. Clara felt the community around her tense for conflict, but she also knew that violence would destroy everything she had come to value about Haven Valley. "Mrs. Thornfield," Clara called out, stepping forward despite Ruth's attempt to hold her back. "What exactly do you want from your son?" The older woman's cold gaze fixed on Clara with obvious hatred. I want him to fulfill his responsibilities to his family and class, instead of indulging in romantic fantasies with unsuitable women. And if he chooses differently, then he'll learn that choices have consequences, Mrs. Thornfield replied. Both for him and for anyone who encourages defiance. It was Ruth McKenna who broke the tense standoff with words that surprised everyone present. Mrs. Thornfield, isn't it? I believe we have more in common than you might think. The wealthy. Rancher's wife turned her attention to Ruth with obvious disdain. I sincerely doubt that. Both of us are women who've had to make difficult choices to protect our families, Ruth continued calmly. Both of us understand that sometimes love requires sacrifice. The difference is that I've learned to recognize when the sacrifice being demanded is too high. Mrs. Thornfield's expression showed she was not impressed by Ruth's attempt at finding common ground. I don't discuss family matters with strangers. Then perhaps you should discuss them with your son, Ruth suggested. He's a grown man capable of making his own decisions. Why not let him choose his own path? Because his path affects more than just himself, Mrs. Thornfield snapped. The Thornfield name, our business interests, our standing in society, all of it depends on maintaining certain standards. Daniel stepped closer to his mother, his voice carrying new authority. What if I told you I've found something more valuable than social standing? What if I've discovered that there are ways to live that don't require stepping on other people to maintain your position? I'd say you've been influenced by people who don't understand the realities of the world, Mrs. Thornfield replied. This little fantasy of frontier equality is charming, but it doesn't pay bills or maintain the kind of life you've always enjoyed. Maybe I don't want that kind of life anymore. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Clara could see Mrs. Thornfield calculating rapidly, trying to determine how far she could push before her son's defiance became absolute. Very well, Mrs. Thornfield said finally. If you're determined to throw away everything your father and I have built for you, then perhaps you need to understand the full cost of that decision. She gestured to one of her men, who produced a official-looking document from his saddlebags. This is a formal disinheritance notice, prepared by our lawyers and ready for my signature. Sign it, Daniel, and you'll forfeit all claim to Thornfield Ranch, all trust funds established in your name, and all family property. You'll be free to pursue your romantic notions, but you'll do it with exactly the resources you've earned through your own efforts. The ultimatum was brutal in its simplicity. Daniel could have Clara and their child, but only if he was willing to give up the wealth and security that had defined his entire existence. Clara held her breath, knowing that this moment would determine not just their future together, but Daniel's fundamental character. Daniel looked at the document, then at his mother, and finally at Clara. When he spoke, his voice was steady and certain. Where do I sign? Mrs. Thornfield's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and finally something that might have been grudging respect. You're making a mistake that will destroy your life. No, Daniel replied, taking the pen offered by one of her men. I'm making a choice that will finally let me start living. He signed the document with firm strokes, then handed it back to his mother. There, it's done. Mrs. Thornfield studied the signature, then folded the document carefully and returned it to her saddlebag. Don't expect to change your mind in a few months when the reality of poverty sets in. This decision is final. I understand, Daniel said, and I'm at peace with it. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something like sorrow cross Mrs. Thornfield's face, as if she was genuinely grieving the loss of her son. But the expression was quickly replaced by cold determination. Very well. You've made your choice, and you'll live with the consequences. She turned to Clara with a final warning. Enjoy your victory, girl. But remember that raising children requires more than love and good intentions. When winter comes and you're struggling to put food on the table, think about what you've cost this child by encouraging his father's foolishness. Mrs. Thornfield remounted her horse and signaled to her men. Within minutes, the entire group was riding back up the valley trail, leaving behind a silence that felt both peaceful and profound. Clara found herself surrounded by community members, offering congratulations and support, but her attention was focused entirely on Daniel. He stood watching his mother's departure with an expression she couldn't read, and she wondered if he was already regretting his impulsive decision. "Do you think she's right?" Clara asked quietly. "About the difficulties we'll face, about what this might cost our child." Daniel turned to her with a smile that was free of doubt or regret. "I think our child will grow up knowing that love is more important than money, that character matters more than social position, and that real wealth comes from being part of a community that values you for who you are." He took Clara's hands in his bandaged ones, his voice growing serious. "Clara Whitmore, I know I have no right to ask this after everything I've put you through, but will you marry me? Not because society demands it, not because my family expects it, but because I love you and want to build a life together based on honesty and mutual respect." Clara looked around at the faces surrounding them, Ruth with her knowing smile, the Canes beaming with approval, Sarah Bramwell nodding encouragement, and dozens of other people who had become her chosen family. She thought about the journey that had brought her from a desperate servant girl to a woman capable of making her own choices about her future. "Yes," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Yes, I'll marry you." The celebration that erupted around them was spontaneous and joyful, with people laughing, crying, and calling out blessings for the couple's future. But Clara barely heard the noise, focused instead on the man who had chosen love over duty, community over privilege, and her over everything else he had ever known. As Daniel pulled her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their commitment, Clara felt the baby kick vigorously, as if celebrating the resolution that would give them all a chance at happiness. The mountains around them stood as silent witnesses to a love that had survived separation, deception, and the crushing weight of social expectations. 3 months later, on a crisp February morning, Clara gave birth to a healthy daughter with Daniel's green eyes and her own determined chin. The birth took place in their small cabin with Sarah Bramwell attending, surrounded by the women of Haven Valley who had become Clara's sisters in every way that mattered. Ruth McKenna was the first to hold the baby after her parents, and as she looked down at the tiny face, she spoke words that would become family legend. "This little one will never know shame for the circumstances of her birth, only pride in the courage her parents showed in choosing love over convention." They named her Hope, and she grew up in a valley where her parents' love story was told as an example of what could be accomplished when people chose their own paths, instead of accepting the limitations others tried to impose. Daniel proved to be a devoted father and husband, and his transformation from privileged heir to valued community member became complete over the months and years that followed. He learned to farm, to build, to contribute meaningfully to the collective effort that sustained Haven Valley, and he never once expressed regret for the fortune he had given up. Clara became the valley's primary teacher, eventually establishing a school that attracted families from throughout the region who wanted their children educated in an environment that valued character over social standing. Her story inspired other women to seek refuge in Haven Valley, creating a community known throughout the territory for its acceptance of people society had cast aside. And on quiet evenings, when Hope was old enough to understand, Clara would tell her daughter about the pregnant servant girl who was cast out into a storm, but who found strength she never knew she possessed and built a life worth living in the mountains where love conquered all. 5 years had passed since that snowy February morning when Hope had entered the world and Haven Valley had transformed into something even more remarkable than Clara had dared imagine during those early days of uncertainty. What had begun as a refuge for society's outcasts had evolved into a thriving community that attracted families from across the territory who sought an alternative to the rigid social hierarchies of more established towns. The settlement now boasted over 200 residents, with new cabins and farms spreading up the hillsides and along the creek tributaries. The original sawmill had expanded into a lumber operation that supplied materials for construction projects throughout the Colorado mountains, while the community's reputation for quality craftsmanship had created steady demand for their furniture, tools, and textiles. Clara stood at the window of the new schoolhouse, a substantial two-story building that had replaced the original one-room structure, watching her daughter play with the other children during their afternoon recess. At 5 years old, Hope displayed the same determined spirit that had carried Clara through her darkest moments, but tempered with a confidence that came from never having experienced rejection or shame. The child was explaining something with animated gestures to a group of younger children, her dark hair catching the sunlight and her green eyes bright with enthusiasm. Clara smiled, recognizing Daniel's passion for teaching and their daughter's natural leadership among her peers. "She's going to be a teacher like her mother," said a familiar voice behind Clara. Ruth McKenna entered the classroom, her own daughter Mary at her side. Now 19, Mary had grown into a capable young woman who helped manage the community's various enterprises and had recently announced her engagement to Tom Morrison. "Or maybe a community organizer like her honorary grandmother," Clara replied. Warmly, Ruth had insisted that Hope call her grandmother from the moment the child could speak, cementing bonds that went far deeper than blood relations. "There's someone here to see you," Mary said quietly. "A woman who arrived this morning asking about opportunities for a fresh start. She has a story that sounds familiar." Clara's attention sharpened immediately. Over the years, Haven Valley had become known throughout the region as a place where women in desperate circumstances could find safety and support. Word spread through networks of midwives, sympathetic clergy, and women's aid societies, creating an informal system that guided the desperate to their mountain sanctuary. "Where is she now?" "With Daniel at the mill," Ruth replied. "He's showing her around while we figured out the best way to approach this. Clara, she's very young and very frightened. And she's traveling with 2 small children." The details stirred memories of Clara's own desperate journey to Haven Valley, though her circumstances had been difficult rather than dire. A young woman with children faced challenges that made Clara's situation seem almost simple by comparison. Clara gathered her teaching materials and prepared to leave the school in Mary's capable hands. "Let's go meet her then." And Ruth... Prepare. One of the family cabins. If she's anything like the women who usually find their way here, she need immediate shelter and support. The walk to the sawmill took them past several new construction projects that demonstrated Haven Valley's continued growth and prosperity. A new general store was nearing completion, designed to serve both community needs and the increasing number of visitors who came seeking trade opportunities. The original dining hall had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing population, and plans were underway for a small inn that would provide proper accommodations for travelers. Daniel stood near the mill's main building with a woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, though hardship had etched lines around her eyes that made her seem older. She held the hand of a boy who looked perhaps 4 years old, while a girl of maybe 6 stood close beside her, both children displaying the wariness of those who had learned too young that the world could be dangerous. When Daniel saw Clara approaching, his face brightened with the smile that still made her heart skip after all these years of marriage. His appearance had changed significantly from the soft gentleman who had first arrived in the valley. Daily physical labor had broadened his shoulders and strengthened his hands, while the mountain sun had weathered his face into something more rugged but equally attractive. "Clara, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Turner," Daniel said, his voice carrying the gentle tone he used with frightened animals and traumatized people. "Rebecca, this is my wife Clara, the teacher I was telling you about." Rebecca Turner bobbed a nervous curtsy, her eyes darting between Clara's face and the ground. "Mrs. Thornfield, Your husband said you might be able to help us find work and shelter. We don't have much money, but we're willing to work hard." Clara noticed that Rebecca automatically assumed she would be addressed by Daniel's family name, not realizing that she had abandoned those social conventions along with everything else from her old life. "Please call me Clara, and yes, we can definitely help you. But first, let's get you and the children somewhere comfortable where we can talk properly." The family cabin Ruth had prepared was one of several structures the community maintained for newcomers, furnished with everything necessary for immediate occupancy. As Rebecca settled her children with milk and fresh bread, Clara observed the subtle signs that told the story of their recent hardships. Clothes that had once been of good quality but were now worn and mended, the way Rebecca automatically positioned herself between strangers and her children, and the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of recent trauma. "Where have you traveled from?" Clara asked gently, once the children were occupied with their food and simple toys Ruth had provided. "Kansas," Rebecca replied quietly. My late husband owned a small farm outside Topeka. When he died in an accident last spring, his brother claimed the property and turned us out. Said women had no business trying to run farms, and that the children would be better off in an orphanage." The familiar story of women's powerlessness in the face of male relatives and legal systems that favored men, regardless of competence or character, stirred Clara's protective instincts. "How did you hear about Haven Valley?" A woman in Denver, a midwife named Mrs. Patterson, said. There was a place in the mountains where women could make their own way without depending on male relatives for survival. She said to ask for Ruth McKenna and mentioned that Jake Morrison had sent me. Clara exchanged glances with Ruth, recognizing the network that had guided so many women to safety over the years. Mrs. Patterson was the same cook who had smuggled food to Clara on her last night at Thornfield Ranch, and who had since moved to Denver, where she provided discreet assistance to women in desperate circumstances. "You're safe here," Clara said firmly. "The question now is what kind of life you want to build for yourself and your children." Over the following hours, Clara and Ruth worked with Rebecca to assess her skills and interests, determine the children's needs, and develop a plan for integrating the family into community life. Rebecca proved to have experience with bookkeeping and correspondence that would be valuable to the community's growing business enterprises, while her children were bright and eager for the stability that regular schooling would provide. That evening, as Clara tucked Hope into bed in their comfortable cabin, her daughter asked the question that had been hovering in her mind all day. "Mama, why was that lady so scared when she first came here? We're nice people." Clara sat on the edge of Hope's bed, considering how to explain concepts of powerlessness and social vulnerability to a child who had never experienced either. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people have difficult experiences that make them afraid to trust new situations, even when those situations might be good for them. Like when I was scared to pet the new horse, until I learned he was gentle." Exactly like that. Mrs. Turner has had some bad experiences with people who should have taken care of her, so she needs time to learn that we really do want to help her and her children. Hope considered this seriously, her young face reflecting the thoughtfulness that had marked her personality from infancy. "Will she stay and be part of our family like Grandmama Ruth and Mary?" "I hope so," Clara replied. "But that will be her choice to make when she's ready." Later that night, as Clara and Daniel sat by their fireplace discussing the day's events, Daniel raised concerns that had been troubling him since Rebecca's arrival. "She's running from more than just poverty and homelessness," he said quietly. "Did you see the way she flinched when Tom Morrison moved too quickly near her? And how she keeps the children close at all times? I think there's violence in her recent past." Clara had noticed the same signs, recognizing patterns of behavior that suggested recent trauma beyond the loss of her husband and home, which means she'll need extra time and patience to feel truly safe here. "And it means whoever she's running from might come looking for her," Daniel added grimly. We should be prepared for the possibility that her arrival could bring trouble. To the valley, the concern was valid but not unprecedented. Over the years, Haven Valley had occasionally faced challenges from people seeking to reclaim women who had fled abusive situations, or to collect children from mothers deemed unfit by male relatives. The community had developed protocols for dealing with such threats, including legal strategies and, when necessary, more direct forms of protection. "We'll handle whatever comes," Clara said confidently. "We always have." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock at their door interrupted the quiet evening. Daniel answered to find Rebecca Turner standing in the darkness, her children visible behind her in the shadows. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Rebecca said hesitantly, "but I heard riders approaching the valley. They stopped when they saw the lights, but they're still out there, and I think they might be looking for me." Clara felt the familiar surge of protective determination that had sustained her through her own trials. "Bring the children." Inside, Daniel get word to Ruth and Tom. "It looks like we're going to have visitors." As Rebecca and her children settled by their fireplace, Clara began preparations for what had become a familiar ritual in Haven Valley, protecting one of their own from those who would exploit or harm them. The community that had saved her life was about to demonstrate once again that some bonds of chosen family were stronger than blood, law, or convention. Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew closer, but Clara felt no fear. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it, and she was surrounded by people who shared that understanding. Whatever challenges awaited them in the darkness, they would face them together, as they always had. The pregnant servant girl who had once trembled in a storm was now a woman capable of creating storms of her own, when necessary to protect those she loved. And in a valley where love had indeed conquered all, that was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.